December 23, 1944. The frozen morning air cut through the Scottish Highlands like a blade, settling over Camp 21 at Cultybraggan near Comrie, Perthshire. Inside the sprawling prisoner-of-war compound, behind rows of barbed wire and watchtowers manned by British guards, more than 400 German prisoners stirred in their wooden huts. Most were ordinary soldiers, weary men grateful to have survived the war's brutal campaigns. But among them walked a different breed, fanatical devotees of the Third Reich who had transformed this remote corner of Scotland into a theater of invisible terror. At precisely 8 o'clock that morning, during the routine roll call, British camp authorities discovered the body of Feldwebel Wolfgang Rosterg, aged 35, hanging from a pipe in the compound latrine. His face was swollen beyond recognition, blood crusted across features beaten into pulp, his neck encircled by the rope that had stolen his final breath. The scene was staged to resemble suicide, but the savage injuries covering his body told a different story, one of calculated murder, mob violence, and a secret justice system operating in plain sight of British military authority. The problem that autumn was not merely one murder in a prison camp. It was symptomatic of a cancer metastasizing throughout Britain's network of prisoner-of-war facilities. By late 1944, the United Kingdom held approximately 400,000 German prisoners, their numbers swelling with each Allied advance across occupied Europe. These men arrived not as a homogeneous mass but as a cross-section of Nazi Germany's fractured soul, hardened SS fanatics alongside disillusioned Wehrmacht conscripts, true believers alongside those who had begun to question everything they once held sacred. The British government had developed an ambitious program of re-education, designed to demonstrate to prisoners the evils of the Nazi regime while promoting democratic values. But within the compounds themselves, another form of education was taking place, enforced not through lectures or pamphlets but through intimidation, violence, and death. The architects of this shadow regime were the unrepentant Nazis, men who viewed the war's trajectory not as defeat but as temporary setback, who saw collaboration with British authorities not as pragmatism but as unforgivable treason. They had brought with them from the collapsing Reich a medieval concept reborn in 20th century brutality, the Heilige Femegerichte, or Holy Vehm Courts, secret tribunals that had once operated in medieval Germany to punish those who betrayed community standards, legionmagazine.com. In the prisoner camps of Britain, these courts reconstituted themselves as Kangaroo Courts. Mock trials held in darkness, verdicts delivered in whispers, sentences carried out with rope and fists and boots. The British, despite their intelligence apparatus and their careful monitoring of prisoner activities, found themselves confronting an enemy that operated not through coded messages or escape tunnels, but through a culture of fear so pervasive that even those who witnessed murder remained silent. The man who would become the first victim of this systematic terror at Cultybraggan arrived at the camp just 6 days before his death. Wolfgang Rosterg had been transferred from Camp 23 at Le Marchant Barracks in Devizes, Wiltshire, along with 30 other prisoners, all of them suspected participants in what became known as the Devizes Plot. The plot itself represented one of the most audacious escape attempts of the war, a plan conceived by fanatical Nazi officers to break free en masse, seize weapons, and sabotage the British war effort from within. The conspiracy was vast in its ambition. Prisoners had been secretly digging tunnels, forging documents, and coordinating with other camps. But in December 1944, British intelligence uncovered the scheme before it could unfold. The failure sparked immediate suspicion among the plotters. Someone, they were certain, had betrayed them, and Wolfgang Rosterg, because he could read and speak English, because he was permitted to read Scottish newspapers and translate them for other prisoners, because he had been seen in conversation with British guards, became the focus of their paranoid fury. What the fanatical prisoners did not know was that their suspicions were largely unfounded. British intelligence had discovered the Devizes Plot not through a single informant but through their sophisticated network of surveillance, a secret operation so effective that it remains one of the war's most remarkable intelligence coups. At 3 locations across Britain, Trent Park near Cockfosters in North London, Latimer House near Amersham, and Wilton Park near Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire, the British had established what appeared to be comfortable prisoner facilities for captured German officers. High-ranking generals were housed in stately homes, allowed to keep personal servants, provided with wine and good food. They played billiards, strolled through gardens, attended parties hosted by their captors. What they did not realize was that every room, every lampshade, every plant pot, even the billiards table itself had been fitted with sophisticated listening devices. In hidden rooms nearby, German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution and joined British intelligence sat with headphones, transcribing every conversation, every boast, every confession that flowed from the prisoners' lips. This operation, codenamed the M Room, the M, standing for microphone, was overseen by Colonel Thomas Kendrick of MI6, who himself spoke fluent German and mingled with prisoners while secretly gathering intelligence. The listening operation had revealed not just military secrets, details of V-1 and V-2 rocket development, U-boat technology, battle plans, but something darker and more disturbing. For the first time, British intelligence heard German army officers, not merely SS fanatics, openly discussing their participation in atrocities and the mass murder of Jews in the East. Fritz Lustig, one of the Jewish secret listeners who survived to tell the story, later recalled marking transcripts with the word atrocity in red pen, his hand steady despite the emotional weight of documenting his people's destruction from the mouths of their killers. The intelligence gathered was so valuable that Colonel Kendrick received an OBE for his efforts. But the transcripts also revealed the depth of ideological fanaticism among certain prisoners, their unwavering loyalty to Hitler, and their contempt for those they viewed as traitors. It was against this backdrop that Wolfgang Rosterg's final 6 days unfolded. From the moment he stepped off the bus at Cultybraggan on December 17, 1944, he was marked. The fanatical prisoners who had been transferred alongside him, men like Erich Pomkoenig, an Oberfähnrich or senior cadet, Joachim Goltz, an Unterscharfer or SS sergeant, Kurt Zulsdorf, an SS private, Heinz Bruning, an SS corporal, and Joseph Mertens, an able seaman, watched his every move. When Rosterg obtained newspapers and read aloud articles predicting the failure of Germany's Ardennes offensive, the desperate winter attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, their suspicions hardened into certainty. To them, his access to information, his linguistic abilities, his apparent comfort in communicating with the British all pointed to one conclusion. He was a spy, a traitor, a man who had betrayed the Devizes Plot and deserved the ultimate punishment. The tribunal convened in secret, somewhere in the shadowed corners of Compound B. There are no records of this court, no written verdicts, only the testimony that would later emerge during the trial of Rosterg's killers. The fanatical prisoners appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner, invoking the ancient Femegerichte tradition to legitimize what was, in essence, a lynching. The verdict was predetermined: death. The method was to be strangulation, staged to appear as suicide by hanging, thereby avoiding immediate British suspicion and allowing the killers to maintain their reign of terror within the camp. What they did not anticipate was how the savagery of their violence would betray their intentions. The night of December 22nd passed without incident, but in the early hours of December 23rd, before dawn broke over the Highland peaks, the assassins moved. Shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning, Wolfgang Rosterg was dragged from his bed in Hut 4. Testimony from witnesses, prisoners who saw but dared not intervene, later painted a scene of calculated brutality. Rosterg was taken first to a hut used as an office by the compound leader. There, Pomkoenig confronted him directly, telling Rosterg that if he had any honor, he would hang himself. When Rosterg replied that he was not able to do it, the rope was placed around his neck and he was pushed outside, where a crowd had gathered. The crowd included every one of the men who would later stand trial for his murder. What happened next was not an execution but an extended torture. Joachim Goltz seized the end of the rope and threw Rosterg to the ground. Multiple prisoners fell upon him, kicking and stomping with their boots. Hans Klein, one of those later indicted, struck Rosterg in the face with an iron bar taken from stove equipment, while Goltz held the rope tight, tightening it around the victim's throat. Rosterg shouted loudly, his cries echoing across the compound, but no British guards intervened. The prisoners dragged him by the rope toward a washhouse, attempting to clean the blood from his face, but fresh blood continued to flow from his wounds. Someone produced a piece of paper, allegedly found on Rosterg, and read from it aloud, fabricated evidence of his supposed treason. When asked if he had committed these betrayals, Rosterg could only groan in response. They took him to the compound office, where POW emerged alone and announced to the waiting crowd, "We are doing it all quietly and gently. He has signed something about his having to hang himself, but he doesn't know that yet." The statement revealed their plan, to force Rosterg to sign a suicide note before killing him. But by this point, Rosterg was barely conscious. Witnesses saw him lying on the ground as Goltz knelt upon his chest and placed hands around his throat, strangling him while others kicked him in the face and body. Rolf Hersig, Joseph Mertens, and others participated in this final assault. Then, with Rosterg dead or dying, they dragged him to the latrine and hanged his body from a pipe, attempting to create the illusion of self-inflicted death. The discovery of Rosterg's body at the 8:30 roll call initially seemed to support the suicide narrative. British medical staff believed they detected vital signs and attempted resuscitation, but their efforts failed. However, the subsequent autopsy conducted by British physicians revealed the truth. The medical examination determined that Rosterg had died from strangulation, and that the wounds from his beating, while extensive, were insufficient to cause death on their own. The physicians concluded that Rosterg had been strangled to death before being hanged in the latrine. The hanging was post-mortem staging. This finding transformed the investigation from a suspected suicide into a murder inquiry, and British military police began the painstaking work of identifying the perpetrators. The investigation faced enormous obstacles. The culture of silence within the prisoner compounds was absolute. Witnesses feared that speaking to British authorities would mark them as the next victims. The fanatical element within the camp had successfully created an atmosphere of terror that extended beyond Rosterg's death. But gradually, through careful interrogation and by offering protection to prisoners willing to testify, British investigators pieced together the events of that morning. 12 prisoners were initially indicted for Rosterg's murder, but charges were dropped against 4 due to insufficient evidence. On July 2, 1945, nearly 7 months after the crime and 2 months after Germany's unconditional surrender, 8 prisoners stood trial before a military court at the London Cage, the same facility that had served as an interrogation center during the war. The trial lasted from July 2 through July 12, 1945, and exposed not just the details of one murder but the broader system of intimidation and secret justice operating in British camps. All 8 defendants pleaded not guilty. Their defense strategy was remarkable in its brazenness. They argued that Rosterg deserved to be killed for being a traitor to Germany. To support this argument, they claimed that British prisoners of war held at a camp in Breslau had killed an officer they believed had betrayed escape plans to German authorities, and no action had been taken against those British POWs. The defending officer was unaware of this case, and the Air Ministry was unable to verify it. Ultimately, the judge ruled it irrelevant to the trial. What mattered was not whether Rosterg had actually been an informer. He almost certainly had not, but whether prisoners had the right to murder fellow prisoners they suspected of collaboration. The judge presiding over the case acknowledged that Rosterg would have been seen as deserving of contempt from the defendant's point of view, but prosecutors successfully argued that this perception did not grant them the right to commit murder. Observers noted that the defendants appeared bored or otherwise disinterested at points during the trial, a disturbing indication that they felt no remorse and still believed they had acted correctly according to their twisted code of honor. The tribunal heard testimony from witnesses who described in graphic detail the beating, strangling, and hanging. They heard about the secret court, the forced confession, the coordinated violence, and they heard about the broader pattern of intimidation that made such killings possible. The verdicts were handed down on July 12, 1945. Hans Klein was acquitted on the 3rd day of the trial due to insufficient evidence. Herbert Wunderlich was found not guilty at the end of the proceedings. Rolf Hersig was convicted but sentenced to life imprisonment rather than death. The remaining 5, Erich Pomkenig, Kurt Zulsdorf, Joachim Goltz, Joseph Mertens, and Heinz Bruning, were sentenced to death by hanging. The executions were scheduled for October 6, 1945, at Pentonville Prison in London. At 9 o'clock on that Saturday morning, in the execution chamber at Pentonville, Britain's most famous hangman, Albert Pierrepoint, carried out the sentences. Pierrepoint, who would execute more than 400 people during his career, approached his work with cold professionalism. He was assisted by Stephen Wade. The 5 condemned men were led to the gallows and hanged, their deaths carefully calculated to be as swift and humane as the method allowed, a mercy they had denied Wolfgang Rosterg. This execution was remarkable not just for the individual fates involved but for its place in British legal history. It was the largest mass execution in the United Kingdom since 1883, when the perpetrators of the Phoenix Park murders, the assassination of British officials in Dublin, had been hanged. It would also prove to be the last mass execution ever carried out in Britain, marking the end of an era. But Wolfgang Rosterg was not the only victim of the secret courts operating in British prisoner camps. Just 3 months after Rosterg's murder, on March 24, 1945, another killing unfolded at Lodge Moor POW camp near Sheffield. The victim was Unteroffizier Gerhard Rettig, a 25-year-old sergeant. Prisoners at Lodge Moor had been digging an escape tunnel, and when British authorities discovered it, fanatical prisoners immediately suspected betrayal. Rettig had been spotted passing a note to one of the guards, which sealed his fate in the minds of his accusers. 2 prisoners, Gefreiter Armin Kuhn, just 18 years old according to his birth certificate, and Feldwebel Emil Schmittendorf, aged 31, appointed themselves executioners. On that March Saturday, arrangements were being made to transfer Rettig to a different camp for his own protection. But the killers struck before the transfer could occur. They attacked Rettig with savage efficiency, beating and kicking him repeatedly. He died in hospital later that night, his injuries so severe that there could be no question of accident or self-defense. A fellow prisoner who witnessed the attack identified Kuhn and Schmittendorf as the ringleaders. They were tried by courts-martial and found guilty of murder. On November 16, 1945, Albert Pierrepoint returned to Pentonville Prison to hang them both, assisted by Alex Riley. The 2 executions may have been carried out side by side or separately. Records are unclear on this detail, but the result was the same. 2 more men paid with their lives for participating in the shadow justice system that Nazi ideology had implanted in British soil. These 2 cases, Rosterg at Cultybraggan and Rettig at Lodge Moor, represent only the murders that British authorities successfully prosecuted. How many other prisoners died in similar circumstances, their deaths successfully disguised as suicides or accidents, their killers protected by the wall of silence that characterized the fanatical element within the camps? The exact number will likely never be known, but evidence suggests that intimidation, assault, and even murder were more widespread than official records indicate. The re-education program that British authorities had established, with its lectures on democracy and its efforts to deprogram Nazi indoctrination, operated in a parallel universe to the brutal reality of compound life, where hardcore Nazis exercised control through fear and violence. The British government's response to these murders was hampered by several factors. First, the scale of the prisoner population, 400,000 Germans at peak capacity, made comprehensive monitoring impossible. Guards could observe compound perimeters and conduct regular roll calls, but they could not penetrate the internal dynamics of prisoner society. Second, the language barrier meant that much of what transpired among prisoners remained opaque to British personnel, despite the presence of interpreters. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, provided limited guidance on how to address crimes committed by prisoners against each other. The convention focused primarily on ensuring that captive nations did not abuse prisoners. It did not anticipate that prisoners would establish their own brutal justice systems. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the legal status of German prisoners became even more complicated. Technically, with no German government to repatriate them to, the prisoners existed in a kind of legal limbo. Britain retained them as a labor force, employing them in agriculture and reconstruction efforts until 1948. A decision that generated controversy regarding compliance with international law. During these years, approximately 25,000 German prisoners chose to remain in the United Kingdom voluntarily after being released from POW status, integrating into British society and starting new lives. This fact speaks to the complexity of the prisoner experience. For every fanatical Nazi who maintained his loyalty to Hitler's ideology even after the Reich's collapse, there were many more who recognized the war as a catastrophic mistake and sought to build different futures. The psychological aftermath of the murders rippled through multiple communities. For the British authorities, the killings represented a failure of duty, Men under their protection had been murdered while supposedly secure in captivity. The trials and executions were necessary not just for justice but to demonstrate to other prisoners that British law would punish murder regardless of the perpetrator's ideological justifications. For the anti-Nazi prisoners who had lived in fear of the secret courts, the trials offered vindication and relief. Many of these men had witnessed atrocities or had been threatened themselves. Seeing their tormentors face British justice affirmed that their suffering had been recognized. For the families of the victims, Rosterg's relatives in Germany, Rettig's loved ones, the executions provided a measure of closure, though the pain of loss could never be fully ameliorated. For the fanatical prisoners who survived, the executions served as a brutal education in the consequences of their ideology. Some undoubtedly maintained their Nazi beliefs in secret, but the re-education program, combined with the unmistakable evidence of Germany's defeat and the emerging revelations of Holocaust atrocities, gradually wore away at the foundations of their worldview. By the time the last German prisoners left Britain in 1948, the world they had fought to defend had been utterly destroyed, its leaders dead by suicide or execution, its crimes documented for posterity at the Nuremberg trials. The Heilige Femegerichte that had terrorized the compounds were revealed as nothing more than thuggery dressed in medieval costume. Brutal men imposing their will through violence because reason and morality had abandoned them. The enduring legacy of these murders extends beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators. The case of Wolfgang Rosterg and the others who died in similar circumstances illuminates a broader truth about totalitarian ideology. It does not respect boundaries or recognize limits. Even in captivity, even in defeat, even when their cause was demonstrably lost, the fanatics sought to maintain control through terror. They brought the apparatus of Nazi Germany, its suspicion, its brutality, its contempt for individual human dignity, into British prisoner camps and reconstituted it in miniature. The British response, though imperfect and hampered by practical constraints, ultimately affirmed the principle that no ideology justifies murder, that even prisoners of war possess rights that must be protected, and that justice must be pursued even when convenient to ignore. The physical sites of these crimes have largely been transformed or forgotten. Cultybraggan camp, where Wolfgang Rosterg died, was used for various purposes after the war and later became a civilian facility. Lodgemore camp near Sheffield similarly transitioned to other uses. But the historical record preserves these events, ensuring that the victims are remembered and that the lessons remain accessible to future generations. The transcripts of the trials, the medical reports, the witness testimonies, all exist in archives, waiting for researchers and historians to excavate them and ensure that this dark chapter of World War II history is not forgotten. In reflecting on these murders, we confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, ideology, and the limits of authority. How could men, supposedly civilized products of European culture, reduce themselves to lynch mobs operating by medieval codes? How could they maintain their belief in Nazi righteousness even as the evidence of Germany's defeat and moral bankruptcy mounted daily? The answer lies partly in the nature of totalitarian indoctrination, which functions not through reasoned persuasion but through the systematic destruction of independent thought, replacing it with absolute loyalty to the state and its ideology. For the fanatical prisoners, admitting that Rosterg did not deserve to die would require admitting that their entire worldview was false, that they had dedicated their lives to a monstrous cause. Rather than face that psychological abyss, they doubled down on their beliefs, finding in violence a temporary affirmation of meaning. But the story also reveals the resilience of justice and the determination of those who refused to let ideology triumph over human decency. The British investigators who painstakingly built the murder cases, the witnesses who risked retaliation to testify, the judges who navigated the complex legal terrain, the executioner who carried out the sentences, all played their parts in ensuring that the victims were not forgotten and that the killers faced consequences. In a war defined by industrial-scale atrocities, these individual murders in British prison camps might seem minor. But each life lost mattered. Each act of justice affirmed the principles that the Allies claimed to fight for. Each execution demonstrated that even the most fanatical believers in Nazi ideology would ultimately answer for their crimes. December 23, 1944, began as an ordinary day at Cultybraggan camp, with frost on the ground and guards making their rounds and prisoners stirring in their huts. It ended with a murder that would reverberate through the British justice system and into history. Wolfgang Rosterg, a man whose only crime may have been speaking English and reading newspapers, paid with his life for the paranoid fantasies of fanatical men who could not accept that their world was ending. But his death was not in vain. The trial and execution of his killers sent an unmistakable message. That British soil would not tolerate the secret courts and summary executions that characterized Nazi Germany, that even prisoners of war possessed rights that would be defended, and that murder, regardless of its supposed justification, would be met with the full weight of British law. In this sense, Rosterg's death became a victory for the principles of justice and human dignity that the war was fought to defend. A small victory perhaps, measured against the scale of the conflict, but a significant one nonetheless. The rope that killed him was meant to enforce silence and submission. Instead, it became evidence in a trial that exposed the brutal reality of Nazi fanaticism and ensured that those who thought themselves above justice learned, too late, that they were not.